Welcome. Um, at the archive, we see many different themes running through artwork, and we see them across time and space. And some of the themes we see are things like motifs, handprints, certainly concentric circles, dots, repetition, therianthropes. Those are the little animal-like figures with human attributes. And these things show up across all time in rock art and across every continent that has artwork on it. So everywhere but Antarctica. But today I want to talk about a little broader theme that's apparent not just in rock art, but throughout the human experience. And that is persistence of place. Simply put, places become important to people, and those same places sometimes stay important across cultures and across centuries. And this concept shows up in rock art, but it also shows up in much of human monument making. One of the most obvious examples to me is not from the rock art world or the cave art world, but it's from Paris, from Notre Dame. This is the 12th century icon of France. And it sits on the Ile de la Cité in the very heart of Paris. And yet it's built on top of a Gaelic site or a Roman fort from the 3rd century and a Gaelic site before that. And we know this, this place is literally the heart of France. It is point zero in the country. And we know that it's on top of older sites because underneath in the archaeological crypt, there is the ruins of the Roman fort and a Roman villa. And we know this also that it has origins before that from this image of the Celtic Gaelic god Cernunnos that was excavated from the crypt below Notre Dame in the 1700s. And this image, this site, which is from a thing called the Pillar of the Boatman, that was underneath the actual nave of Notre Dame, establishes the site of Notre Dame as being important at least 1,000 years, and probably much, much longer than that before the cathedral's construction. So it's easy maybe to see why Notre Dame would be an important place. It's on an island in the middle of the Seine, in the middle of the country. But honestly, there are other islands in the river, and there are other places that you could build a city. But this place became important a long, long time ago, and it stayed important for centuries. This same sort of persistence shows up again and again in cave art and rock art across the world. In Europe, the first Paleolithic rock art or cave art site to be identified shows that same persistence of place. This is Altamira in Spain, in northern Spain. And Altamira is known from its incredibly well-preserved polychrome bowls that decorate the ceiling. And this was the first cave art site to be identified. In 1879, the bowls were identified, and they were so well preserved and so modern looking at the time that the nascent scientific community rejected them as forgeries. They're that well preserved. They're made in the Magdalenian period of the late Paleolithic, around 14,000 years ago. And in 1879, no one could believe that Paleolithic people were sophisticated enough to produce artwork and images like this. Now, happily, that view changed over time. However, the Magdalenians were not the first people to paint inside of Altamira. In 2010, a team of scientists used uranium-thorium series dating to determine that one of the paintings in Altamira was made in the Aurignacian some 36,000 years ago. This is actually a photograph of that sample being taken. And if you want to know a little bit more about dating techniques, we have a news article on our website about art dating techniques that are used. And I think Steph will drop that into the chat. But these ages are incredible. 14,000 and 36,000. Put another way, the painters of Altamira's famous bulls are closer in age to us today than they are to the original painters of Altamira. They're closer to being our contemporaries than they are to being the contemporaries of the first painters. That plays out again and again in Europe. Chauvet is a famous art cave in France, and it's famous for these incredibly delicately rendered horses and aurochs and rhinoceroses and lions. And there are at least two schools of thoughts about the painting sequence in Chauvet. One is that it was painted 32,000 years ago, and then about 6,000 years later, there's another big imaging period. And the other is that it's painted 36,000 years ago and then revisited for 3,000 to 5,000 years. Either way, these are like mind-bending, mind-numbing timescales. In one theory, everything is painted in black, and then later these finger tracings are made at 26,000 years ago. But clearly, this place becomes important and remains important for a long, long time. Now, one of the most dramatic examples of persistence of place is in northern Spain at Monte Castillo. This is a mountain, this very pyramid-shaped mountain, and it contains 4 significant art caves, Paleolithic caves, and some truly beautiful Magdalenian age artwork. In Las Chimeneas, these very, very delicate, finely drawn deer decorate one of the cave passages. They're done in charcoal. And this is really probably my favorite piece of Paleolithic artwork, just because they're so minimalist and so delicately done. They're done in charcoal, so there's a carbon-14 date that places these at 15,000 years old, right at the in the heart of the Magdalenian period. Also in the same mountain in El Castillo is this engraved rock, also thought to be Magdalenian. But there are real surprises inside of El Castillo as well. Most of the images were assumed to be Upper Magdalenian. However, recent dating techniques have pushed those dates back considerably. This handprint is now known to be 36,000 years old, so more than twice as old as originally thought. And a red disc from this wall is 40,700 years old. And there are other dates out of another cave in the mountain called La Pasiega that are even older than that. So this means that at a minimum, the caves in Monte Castillo are decorated over a 25,000 year time span. This place is important, and it stays that way over a mind-bending length of time. In fact, it stays that way for so long that we think that Neanderthals used it as well. So it's just so much time for one place in human existence to be super, super utilized. Now, our basic understanding of the outline of human occupation of the planet is this. We begin as a unique species about 300,000 years ago in Africa. And by 100,000 years ago, we're making paint and making images. By the time we emerge from Africa into the rest of the world, we've got a complete artistic toolkit that's built into us as part of our survival strategy. Artwork then begins to show up every place on the planet that we move to. Now, sometime around 22,000 years ago, which the best evidence is now that we get into the Americas at least 22,000 years ago, we cross into what's now known as the Americas. And think of it this way: here are 2 vast continents that have never seen hominids before. And yet here, that same pattern of persistence of place continues albeit on a more truncated time scale. This is Three Rivers petroglyph site in the Tularosa Basin in New Mexico. And it is a great example of that persistence of place. It's a dramatic site. It overlooks white sands, and there are 21,000 individual rock art images at Three Rivers spread out over 50 acres. Now think about that, 21,000 images. It is just so many different figures. And stylistically, they're Jornada Mogollon, which is, and there's occupation at that site for over 1,000 years. And the vast majority of these images are associated with the Jornada Mogollon culture. But there are issues with dating petroglyphs. I mean, the primary issue is that they're really hard to date. And so oftentimes these things are dated stylistically, meaning that they look like images or styles that you'll see in pottery, which is far easier to date because it exists inside an archaeological layer. You know, petroglyphs sit up on the surface, so there you don't have soil you can dig into to establish a chronology. You don't have carbon associated with the images that you can date. In this case, they're on basalt boulders, so you can't use uranium thorium dating, and they're just very hard to get the sequence of. But Three Rivers is just astounding, and while the bulk of the images are stylistically associated with the Mogollon culture, there are more recent images as well. The number of just individual petroglyphs at Three Rivers is just mind-boggling. So clearly this was an important place over a very long period of time just to get that number of individual figures out there. In the east, persistence of place is evident. This is a site on the Tennessee River in Alabama. And that red striped line is Mississippian era. But you can clearly see on the right-hand side of the frame that there is a figure with a European style hat. So this spans pre-European and European contact. Persistence of place applies to Epigee Mounds as well. Here's a site in Adams County, Ohio, called Serpent Mound. This is the largest snake effigy in the world. It's a 1,300-foot long snake mounted on the landscape. And current thinking is that it's from the Fort Ancient culture, about 1,000 AD to 650, somewhere in there. It's one of our Mural of America sites where we are building a 3D VR experience of this to help interpret it and allow virtual visitation. However, there are also older burial mounds at this site. There are Adena burial mounds that are at least 1,000 years older. And there has always been some controversy surrounding the age of Serpent Mound because it's very hard to establish. Ben Barnes, who's the chief of the Shawnee, and his people, his tribe is associated with this area of Ohio and specifically with this site, told me point blank, if he had one thing that he could answer from Serpent Mound, it would be exactly how old it is, because he would like to know if it was Shawnee who made it definitively, because he feels like it is for a lot of reasons, or if it was an older culture where they would be more loosely associated. He said he would really like to know. But clearly it has been an important place for at least 1,000 years. Now, usually there are a lot of questions involved in rock art and rock art dating in sequencing rock art and establishing things like persistence of place. But there is one site at the edge of Cedar Mesa, at the edge of the Bears Ears in Utah, that really gives us a clear evidence, that gives us clear evidence of the sequence. Here we have what's gone on is that a style called Glen Canyon Linear was laid down on this boulder. So Glen Canyon Linear, it's on the right-hand side, and these are the figures that are horizontal to the ground, but they were put up in a normal vertical plane. What's happened is the Glen Canyon Linear was laid down. Here's the boulder as it exists now. And then this boulder fell. And it either fell off a cliff or fell off the position that it was in. It rotated 90 degrees. And the later basket maker 2, this post-archaic culture comes in over 1,000 years later and makes these duck-headed figures you see on the left. So you have these two sets of figures that are 90 degrees opposed to each other. And usually rock art doesn't play out in a geologic timescale like this, but it is one of these sites that really lets you see that different cultures come in at different times to the same place and put down different styles of artwork. Now, the final site I want to talk about today is another of our Mural of America sites, and it's the Rochester Rock Art Panel in Utah. It's in Emery County, Utah. It's managed by the BLM, and it's a fantastic site on a promontory that overlooks Muddy Creek down in the southern part of the county. And it is famous for this very intricately carved style of rock art that's generally thought to be Fremont. So 1300 years ago, or 1300 AD at the earliest, and the figures are fantastic. Giant anthropomorphs with elongated bodies, great big eyes, headdresses, fantastic animals, incredible detail in petroglyphs. Usually petroglyphs are not this detailed, but you look at what is available in the artwork at Rochester, and it is just astounding. And it is all generally of one style. But even here on this promontory that is so well known for one thing, you go to the back side of that promontory, and there are different figures from a different age. Boxed anthropomorphic figures, likely archaic, so much older than those that we saw on the other panel. And again, persistence of place. All those images are on this promontory overlooking Muddy Creek. And you can see why that would be a good place to be. But that's what persistence of place really means, is places become good, maybe sometimes for obvious reasons, sometimes for not obvious reasons, and they stay that way. Why they stay that way, we don't know. Except to say that good places are good places, and people like to go to them. So this is one of our Mural of America sites, and we are in the process of building a 3D VR model that will allow visitation, so you don't have to go to central Utah to see it, although it's fabulous in person. And I think Steph is also going to drop a link to our first Mural of America site, which is Devil Step Hollow Cave in Tennessee, into the chat if people haven't seen that. It gives you an idea of what we do at these sites. Go in, work with Native communities to develop storytelling, work with the landowners to develop storytelling as a way to not explain what the site means, but to explain its significance and why people ought to care about rock art. Because what it does is it tells us about not just who we were in the past, but who we are now. Because that same behavior that I'm explaining in this talk, that persistence of place, it's something that we do today.